And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Thank you for joining us today on the aviation portion of your broadcast. I'm meteorologist Emily Niebuhr. Let's first take a look at your satellite imagery across the state. You can see we have a low pressure system spinning out in the Bering. We have a second low pressure system moving across the eastern Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula today. Those systems will impact our visibilities as they push towards the east on your Friday morning. Expect widespread IFR conditions. Again, IFR indicates instrument flight rules, which means it's challenging visibilities and ceilings for pilots. And so you can expect along much of the coast as that system progresses eastward on Friday morning, some lower visibilities and ceilings across much of the Bering Coast and into portions of the Chukchi Sea, even at portions of the western parts of the Gulf of Alaska, so lower visibilities in Kodiak and on portions of the Kenai Peninsula and Alaska Mountains as well. For your Friday afternoon, expect widespread thunderstorms to develop across much of the interior, especially along mountainous areas. So be cautious if you plan to be traveling in the afternoon hours in those areas. But overall, expect great visibility across much of the interior. The exception, again, is we'll have MVFR conditions across much of the western portion of the state as some of that diurnal heating mixes out some of the low stratus and clouds, but still keeps clouds across much of the area as that frontal and low pressure system move eastward. Again, we're having low IFR conditions occurring across Kodiak Island and western portions of the Gulf of Alaska. In our panhandle, conditions are actually looking a little better in interior parts of the panhandle, but just off the coast, expect some lower mixture of IFR and MVFR conditions. Saturday morning, expect a few lingering thunderstorms, especially along the Brooks Range. But again, widespread IFR conditions lingering in some of the coastal areas, again, as that low pressure system moves eastward. Also in the Gulf of Alaska, we have widespread IFR conditions and some MVFR conditions along the coast. Of course, IFR conditions along the Alaska Range. But again, across much of the interior, fairly good visibility Saturday morning. Saturday afternoon, again, around the thunderstorms along the Brooks Range and portions of the Alaska Range. So again, keep an eye out for those. Again, we have some mixing in the afternoon and VFR conditions along the coast, but IFR conditions remain well entrenched across much of the Bering Sea and across the Gulf of Alaska Saturday afternoon. Let's take a look at some of your past weather. For Anaktuvuk Pass, we're expecting VFR conditions with a few thunderstorms developing along the Brooks Range in the afternoon hours. Adigan Pass, same story, VFR conditions with thunderstorms developing in the afternoon. Lake Clark and Merrill expect MVFR conditions with that frontal system. A similar story for Raining Pass, expect MVFR conditions through the pass and possibly a thunderstorm or two. Windy will start out at MVFR conditions but improve to VFR conditions by the afternoon hours. Isabel Pass will be VFR conditions throughout much of your Friday. Mentasta Pass will have VFR conditions with a few thunderstorms developing along the mountains in the afternoon. Tahina Pass will start out as IFR conditions but improve to VFR in the afternoon. Portage will start at IFR with some of that lingering stratus but improve to VFR conditions by your Friday afternoon. Chilkoot and White Passes are expected to be generally VFR conditions as we saw that nicer weather in the Panhandle interior regions. Let's take a look at some of your freezing levels. Again, a little colder air associated with that low, so we're looking at freezing levels at about 8,000 feet. Meanwhile, we have 12,000 feet across much of the eastern or western Gulf of Alaska, just ahead of that system. For your icing on Friday, generally isolated moderate associated with that low pressure and frontal system, but a few areas along the western Aleutians, we're expecting a few considerable moderate areas with that next system moving into the area. For our jet stream, we have one located off our coast, our western Bering coast, 80 knots, widespread 60 to 50 knots across much of the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula associated with that low, and a southerly jet all along interior portions of the western coast at about 70 knots at 30,000 feet. As we go lower in the atmosphere, that jet maintains in strength at about 45 knots across Kodiak Island and across parts of the Alaska Peninsula. Meanwhile, we have that northwesterly jet across much of the Alaska Peninsula, but it's at 35 to 40 knots. Finally, as we get down to about 3,000 feet, see we across the Alaska Peninsula, we're looking about 25 to 35 knots, and a smaller jet from the south across much of Kodiak Island in the Alaska mountains. Finally, as we go to Friday, we have turbulence associated with that jet, impacting Kodiak Island, parts of the Alaska Peninsula, and again, along where that low-level jet was, and portions of the Kenai as well.